certainly no set of political institutions, certainly no kingdom, certainly no individual ruler could hope to keep up with these momentous changes. Consider that at the end of the 15th century, until 1492, Spain was still fighting for its own unification, for finishing what was called the reconquest of Spain from the Islamic rulers. Think that the Austrian rulers, the Holy Roman Emperors, had vast and quite complicated domains, but they did not include the Low Countries, they certainly did not include Spain, and they certainly did not include a world empire across the oceans of the Atlantic and the Pacific. So the challenges were immense, but they also meant a new era of dangers coming from the East, from the Ottoman Empire. And they also meant new, huge complexities with the divisions of Europe by religion now, with the spread of Protestantism across much of Europe rapidly in the early decades of the 1500s. And we would see that they would start to involve the rise of new kingdoms, new powers that would also question and challenge and compete for power with the Habsburgs, especially France. And so the challenges facing Charles V were absolutely monumental. Already by the 1520s, the Habsburgs were fighting for the survival of their home base in Vienna with the siege of Vienna by the Ottomans in 1529, just barely put down, and with the loss of much of the kingdom of Hungary to the Ottomans in the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. So the challenges from the East were dramatic, but the wars between the Christians and the Protestants also became inflamed very soon. And already by the 1540s and 1550s, the Protestant princes were demanding their independence and their ability to practice Protestantism, Lutheranism, or Calvinism within the Holy Roman Empire. And the battles raged. In 1556, Charles V accepted a settlement of Augsburg, which held that each ruler could determine the religion of his own lands. Cuius regio, eius religio. Whoever was the ruler, that would be the religion, and that became a principle that enabled or established or legalized Protestantism within the Holy Roman Empire. Well, it's poignant to ask the question, what do you do when you are the world ruler facing all of these massive, massive challenges as well? And Charles was the first to face that question, and he was the first to give us an answer. In 1556, he abdicated. He said, enough, I'm exhausted, and he divided the kingdom in the same way that the Roman Empire had been divided when it had become so vast in the expanse from west to east and created a eastern and a western part of the Roman Empire. Well, the Habsburgs also divided this world empire, and Charles V gave to his son, Philip II, the Kingdom of Spain and the Kingdom of New Spain and the rule over the Low Countries. And he gave to his brother, Ferdinand, the Archdukedom of Austria and the position of Holy Roman Emperor. So he divided the two parts of the Habsburg holdings into Spain and New Spain and the Low Countries and into the Holy Roman Empire. And we pick up the story with the Escorial here because it was Philip II who then became the most powerful person in the world. and added remarkably one more title briefly to this vast range of power. Philip II was briefly King of England, because Philip II was the husband of Mary, daughter of Henry VIII, who briefly was Queen of England in the 1550s, and with that came Philip as King of England as well. That did not last long. When Mary died and Elizabeth became Queen of England, the Habsburgs did not contest that, and Philip gave up his title of King of England, believing incorrectly that England would remain an ally of Spain, but in fact England became one of the rivals and antagonists of Spain very soon afterwards. Well, Philip II was a very devout ruler, a very Catholic ruler. He was a very firm believer that Protestantism needed to be ended, that it needed to be put down, and that there should be one creed, the Catholic creed, in his lands. And one could say he was rather stubborn and inflexible on this point. And this, of course, inflamed his subjects in the Protestant lands. Spain had accidentally inherited the Low Countries through marriage, but the Low Countries, and especially the 7 provinces of what would become the Netherlands, were firmly Protestant, and they were having nothing of the repression that Philip II demanded with the suppression of Protestantism and his call for a Catholic kingdom. And so what ensued was what would be an 80-year war, starting in 1568 and lasting until Netherlands' independence from Spain in the 17th century. Well, it was just about this time, one could say at the peak of Philip II's holdings, that he decided to build this monumental structure, this greatest Renaissance structure ever created. He called the lead architect Juan de Herrera. This is called a Herrerian architecture. It is Renaissance, but austere, clean, straight lines in the piety and the austerity of Philip II himself. It is a grand and monumental structure that is fitting for the closest thing that one had to the ruler of the world. Now, Philip's intransigence, his insistence, his claim that he famously made when he said, before creating any damage to religion in the service of God, I would rather lose all my estates and my life 100 times if I could do so, rather than to be desired to be ruler over heretics. He wanted to rule Catholics, and so he ended up in war, and in continuous war, and in war that repeatedly bankrupted his kingdom, drove the kingdom to several financial defaults. Despite the bullion flowing in from the New World, he was unable to maintain the finances. And then in 1588, in frustration that England had remained a Protestant country rather than turning back to Catholicism, he decided to invade the British Isles. And he sent his great armada in 1588, and because of massive storms and bad fortune, the Spanish Armada was defeated by England in the famous defeat of 1588. It wasn't actually a decisive loss of all of the ships by the English guns. Many were destroyed by the bad luck of massive storms. Many survived and simply retreated, but the invincibility of Spain was lost. That aura was lost, and that encouraged the Protestant countries to unite to try to repress Spanish power. It encouraged the French kings, though Catholic, also to compete increasingly with Spain. It encouraged Holland and England to challenge Spanish holdings in the New World, to raid them, to capture Spanish galleons, to attack them in the New World. And the Habsburg power, the Spanish power over the New World and its holdings in Europe became more and more difficult. At the same time, the Ottomans did not give up in the 17th century. They repeated their attacks. They repeated their attempt to conquer Vienna. And while the Austrian Habsburgs, with Christian allies, ended up defeating the Ottomans, this was another century of war. We can say that while Philip II and in his unwillingness to compromise with the Low Countries, for example, led to chronic and costly and eventually bankrupting wars that perhaps could have been avoided with more diplomacy and a bit less religious stricture, a bit more tolerance. The rule of Philip II proved to be very difficult and no easier in the 17th century with Philip III and Philip IV, and then Charles II. Charles II was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, born with major disabilities, probably because of all of the inbreeding and the genetics that came with that. Charles II was enfeebled and unable to rule. Charles II died in 1700 in an empire that had lost much of its power, was on the defensive, was feeling all of the competition from Britain, from newly independent Holland, from rising France. And after Charles II's deaths, there ensued a war of which house would govern Spain. Would it be the Habsburgs continuing in a line that would continue to rule, or would it be another house? And it was the King of France that pushed to put a Bourbon king in place. The War of Spanish Succession raged for 14 years. It ended in a kind of mixed settlement. The Habsburgs lost the kingdom. Bourbons would rule ever since until today. The Bourbon line would rule, but in one concession to the balance of power in Europe, the Bourbon kings of Spain forever renounced their claims on the French throne, and the French their claims on the Spanish throne. Well, by the end of the 18th century, Spain was even in poorer condition and weaker shape compared to the rising power of its neighbors, and Spain was invaded by Napoleon at the end of the 18th century in the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon imposed yet another family, the Bonaparte family, his family, temporarily as rulers of Spain. The power was here. The power was the seat of the Escorial, the greatest concentration of power in one ruler in the history of the world. And it is a remarkable story of how that came about, but also a remarkable lesson that in a big and wide world, power can never reside in one country. Others will fight for their say, their role. They will balance the power of that hegemonic power. It's a story that remains true until today. We live in a big world, and power could never be held for a long term in just one nation's hands.